Hello, welcome back to the Turning In podcast. On today's episode, Amy and I do a bit of a public service announcement talking about why I.F.S can be so difficult to practice at times and why it's so important to make sure that you are well trained if you are a practitioner, or that you are working with someone who is well trained if you are a client. We come in a little bit hot at times, I'm going to be honest, and it's truly out of reverence for the model. Thank you, as always, for coming back. We really, really appreciate your time. I say that every single episode because it is so very true. I hope that you enjoy, and let's go ahead and get into it. Welcome back, everyone, to the Turning In podcast. I am one of your hosts, Megan Jones, here as always with Dr. Amy Crawford. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning, all. Today, we have our episode on intermediate syndrome, where we are going to talk about how, and I'm spoiler alert, just because you read a book on I.F.S does not mean that you know how to be an I.F.S practitioner,
or client, or
yeah,
it doesn't mean you know I.F.S if you read a book.
Yeah. So maybe a little. I mean, I'm gonna preface our listeners that we may come in a little bit hot because there are certain times, and I think for Amy especially as the therapist, it becomes really, really annoying, you know, to have to recorrect and backtrack and things like that. And I don't, again, want to, I guess, jump too far into the topic too soon, but I think that's really kind of where the concept of this episode came in, is just constantly sort of having to recorrect and redirect, and wanting to talk about, you know, I.F.S. We have talked about, I mean, I think if I had $1 for every time we said how nuanced this model is.
Yeah. I guess if we had $1 for every time we've said that, we'd actually be getting paid to do this podcast. Right. Which would be cool.
Yeah, which would be cool. Listen, well, I'm not going to get into that. I was like, listen, I guess let's start, Amy. So as the therapist, right? Like I'm not working with clients, I'm working around clients, and I am a client. So I think that my ability to see the patterns that you see is just non-existent in the same way that yours is, right? So what would you say the biggest kind of like inquiry about this whole thing, you know, what's the biggest I.F.S inquiry that you receive, would you say?
Yeah. So being a therapist, you know, having a website, having a few people who know about me now through different platforms and exposure areas, I get a lot of emails each week. Some weeks upwards of, 30 to 50 emails of clients asking to work with me. That's a big week. On a slower week, it's probably around 10. And that's not even just asking questions. It's like, hey, are you taking new clients? And the biggest inquiry I get outside of, are you taking new clients? I mean, that's paired with this. It's like a double-sided, is, hey, I read a book and I'm finding it really hard to work with my parts. I don't know. Like I don't get it. I read the book. I know this idea of parts and I don't get it. So I guess I need to work with somebody, paired with, because I read the book, I think I know it all, but I'm just really having a hard time connecting with my parts. And I get that direct quote all the time. I read a book. I know the model, and yet I'm still struggling connecting with my parts. Yeah. So that's my biggest inquiry that I get is, are you taking new clients because I read a book and I feel like I know the model, but I'm having a hard time connecting with my parts?
Yeah. So kind of either like I'm introduced to the model and I need more help being guided, paired with kind of the juxtaposition of like, I know I.F.S really well and
Mm-hmm.
what's going on. And that's not to say that like these books aren't really super helpful and rich and full of, you know, information. And I mean, it's just not that freaking easy, you guys. It's just not that easy.
No, like it's not that easy, and it's not that easy at all. I mean, I've been playing in the I.F.S realm for since 2010, so 13 years. Started by my own personal journey into it. Even though I was a therapist back then, I was needing my own help. And that, so 13 years. I have 2 PhDs. I've spent close to 30 something $1,000 in I.F.S trainings. And I still struggle working with some of my own parts. I'm not considering myself an expert, and I do consider myself someone who does have access to self on a fairly consistent, reliable basis, and it's still hard sometimes. So the idea that someone can read a book and know the model well enough to work with their system definitely troubles parts of me. I'm not going to lie. And there's for sure different energies, right? And I'll take total ownership that when I get some of these inquiries, I'm reading between the lines on some of the energy in which I get them, as I think we as humans do. Some of the energy generally is, wow, I read this book. I'm super inspired. I'm really curious to do my own work. Can you guide me? Are you taking clients? That
Right.
feels very different than the majority of inquiries of, I read this book and I should be getting it. No, sweet little angels. You should not be getting it. You shouldn't be getting it.
Right.
Like, yeah, you shouldn't be getting it. It's not that easy, actually.
Well, I want to highlight that what you just said, because that's kind of where I was going, where there's sort of like this juxtaposition, and you said it well, of it's not necessarily the juxtaposition of people reaching out. Like if you want more guidance and want more help, that's what we want you to do, is reach out. It's sort of it's the energy there. And it happens with therapists and practitioners as well, where it's like, well, I read this book, I bought Cease's book, whatever.
I've
And
listened
so
to your podcast.
I've listened to your podcast. And so I'm ready to, treat people. And I think where my energy comes up, and I actually like even feel it and identify it in my body right now, I have this like anxiety, because just because you take a 16-hour thing, like workshop, does not mean that you are ready to work with people's exiles. That's really, really scary. And then that's wherein these inquiries come in, where it's like, I was working with somebody and this, and this, but I still feel this way after however long. And it's like, well, yeah, that's because you were misguided. And it's shitty. Like, I'll check the box on this episode. It's shitty.
Well, and with that, it happens both. So this to me is a PSA for both clients and clinicians, practitioners, anybody who's saying they're using the model. This is a PSA for all of us, I think, right? That because you read a book doesn't mean you know the model. Because you read a book doesn't mean you should be able to work with your own system. Because you attended a non-I.F.S.I approved, non-I.F.S.I, workshop doesn't mean you know how to work with clients. My philosophy about that is, at that point, just enough to be dangerous, actually. Just enough to be dangerous, both for your own system and potentially for clients you're working with, if you are in the helping field.
Yeah, just enough to to make that little tweak that could we talk about all the time how this has implications to it. This is an
Yeah.
evidence-based therapy, the psychospiritual therapeutic model. And so doing that when you're not fully abreast to all of the nuance or the majority of the nuance, right? You don't have to be an
Yeah.
absolute 100%. You don't have to be Dr.
No.
Schwartz,
No.
but to be helpful. And well, okay, so this, as we're talking about it, right? So why is it so much harder to do on your own? Like, so I read the
Yeah.
book, I listened to the podcast, I understand the foundations.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it so hard to practice sometimes?
So the reason it's so hard is, in theory, I.F.S is actually pretty straightforward and simple. If you think about it, we're made of parts. We work with our parts. They get attention. They feel better. Cool. And the reason it's not at all easy is because of how complex our internal world is. And most of the time, for those of us who are adults, we have been living with our parts forward facing, driving the bus, ultimately running the show for decades, to the point that we don't even know they're there most of the time. So when a lot of people come into I.F.S, they get the theory, they get the idea that we're made of parts. You start paying attention to them, which is excellent. That's where it has to start, with awareness. But because this notion of self is new and our parts don't know who self is yet, it becomes really hard to unblend. So when we are trying to do our own work without a guide, without a skilled I.F.S.I trained practitioner therapist, we can't tell when we're blending or not. It becomes really hard to go, how am I feeling towards this part? Because then we're in our head, we're like, oh, it's fine. Is it though? So the biggest nuance is, when we're working with our own system, we can't tell when we're blending with other parts, even on subtle, very, very covert ways.
100%. And I think a great example of that is if our listeners go back or have already listened to the I.F.S session and potentially the recap that we did, there are times for me, as somebody who's practiced I.F.S quite thoroughly, much more exploration to do, but there were times when I was in that session and I was fully blended and couldn't identify that, and it felt totally self-driven, and it was 100% a part. Like, it was 100% a part, and I needed you to be the external person where you were able to identify that.
Right. Where my curiosity, my capacity to be in self, to get curious because I'm noticing subtle shifts within your system, within your tone, within your body language, are cues to me, they're tells to me that we may be having another part casting some interference. If another part is present, that is going to block the richness that I.F.S offers. And that is why, after just reading a book, no, you can't do I.F.S on your own after reading a book. After reading a book, you have just enough information to be dangerous. That doesn't mean you're going to end up doing something harmful to your system. It just means you're in that, we can talk about this, but that like intermediate zone, that Dunning-Kruger effect, which is a negative cognitive bias, which we'll talk about here shortly. But just enough to kind of go, oh, yeah, cool, easy. And I see this even with therapists who think they know the model, even though they have not done a level 1, etc., through the I.F.S Institute. Just enough to think you know it because it sounds real easy, but it's not.
Right. Well, and I think the negative implications come more, and correct me, where you may think I'm wrong, but like, if I, as, a client or just a human being that's trying to do my own work through a book, there really is not a huge negative implication that's going to come from that. I
Right.
don't know what I don't
Right.
know. I'm not going to cause, I'm not going to be able, because I'm blended, probably
Mm-hmm.
to bulldoze my own system. I think the
Right.
negative implications really come when you're being guided through
Mm-hmm.
something. So, like going back to that session example where I was in a session in, grief, and I was in I had a self-like part come up. That's all great and
Right.
fine. There's nothing wrong
Mm-hmm.
with my parts coming
No,
up. They're coming up
absolutely
with
not.
good intent and good reason. However, if you hadn't called that out, it does become this bulldozing of the system where I'm then being guided. Um, if you've gone through the education and practice that you did, where you're then as the, guide for me, going to just follow that path and
Right.
not really allow the beauty, like you just said, or richness to ensue of saying, slow down, let's check in, yada, yada, yada.
Well, and there's this phenomenon in I.F.S called backlashing, which I think we've spoken a little bit about before. I kind of can't remember.
Yeah, a little bit.
Where if our parts aren't feeling safe, they can backlash and create some pretty significant impacts, both internally and externally. And so there can be some risk actually in working with therapists and or practitioners who don't know how to effectively show up in self with a client's complicated system. And the parts of us that generally backlash are firefighters, and they're the
Mm,
ones who have more impactful behavior. So, so if you think of it from that perspective, there can be pretty big implications, right? And the beautiful thing is self is always there to help correct and hold and love with compassion. However, for some clients, it's not that easy to get to self without someone kind of guiding the system. That someone has to be someone who knows the model truly.
yeah, 100%. And when you're
You know,
talking about, sorry,
no, go
I
ahead.
feel like I cut you off. Oh, okay. When you're talking about, because we've made this point of, going through a non-IFSI training, and again, the books and these trainings, you guys, they can be a wealth of knowledge. They can
A
be a
great
wealth of info,
resource,
a
a
great
good
resource.
resource,
However, there is kind of, and
not a
I'm gonna
replacement. Great resource, not a replacement.
right, and I don't know if this is maybe a little bit not cool to say. We'll see, but it's kind of like there is this like if you think of IFSI as like the Harvard, like there is kind of this
Mhm.
not elitist, community, but this like elite level of um, training and foundation and expertise through certain avenues, right? And I don't think that that's
Mhm.
bad to call out. Like there
Well, it's the
are,
gold standard, right? It is
there
the
we
gold
go.
standard of I.F.S. That
There we
is
go. That's a good
the
way to put it.
gold standard learning hub of I.F.S. Anything beyond that can be good, can be decent, can be a good resource, can provide information for clients and or therapists who are hungry and thirsty to get some information, and it's not a replacement for IFSI,
Right. Right.
right? And something that if and again, and I think for me, part of the energy I have in this is especially for therapists right now because they're I.F.S. I don't know if y'all just heard my stomach grumble. It just did really loudly. So it wasn't a thunderstorm. That may have been my stomach. If right now I.F.S. has exploded in such a huge way, which is rad. However, with it, I.F.S.I can't keep up with the demand
Mm,
because they are keeping their standards high and wanting to make sure that they ensure that the teaching has what it needs, that it's really hard currently to get into a level 1 training for practitioners, therapists, clinicians, counselors, etc., through the Institute currently. It's a lottery system. When people get in, it's truly like they feel like they got the Willy Wonka gold ticket. I mean, like tears, dancing, posting on Instagram. Oh my God, I got into the level one. It's a miracle. So what happens is that makes parts of us super desperate, super thirsty to get our hands on whatever information we can. Totally honor those parts, well intended. And there's some risk in that, in going to shady places, back alley resources for I.F.S, not the Institute. I'm joking a little bit about that. But I mean, we do. Our parts get desperate because we want to learn. We want to learn this cool model that's revolutionary and life-changing. And just because you read a book or because you did a workshop that may have some really rich information in it and may even have been led by certified I.F.S therapists or names in the I.F.S community, it's not a replacement, right? And this is, and I'm sorry, I'm on one right now. I can shortly step off my soapbox if my parts consent, we'll see. And, this is said all the time in level 1 trainings and is a reminder throughout the level 1 training, throughout the level 2 training, throughout the level 3 training. After someone has learned the model through a level 1 training, it takes 3 years of dedicated, disciplined practice, both with clients and within your own system, to truly master the model. And even then, you haven't really mastered it. It's getting it more intuitively, organically, and on a cellular level. 3 years after a level 1 training. I think that sums up kind of this idea that because you read a book doesn't mean you get it.
Right. Like there is a certain level of, I mean, practice. It's the experiential aspect of it.
And that's what we keep going back to. It's that practice. Thank you for saying that. It's the experience of being in the model to understand how to do the model. It's not, I mean, we have to set theory with words and concepts. I.F.S is not a theoretical model. It is an experiential model. And so to truly know what it's like, you have to be working with the model really as a client. Even as therapists, we need to be clients in order to really get the model, in my opinion.
Well, and I think that goes back to kind of one of the original talking points that you and I had offline of like, at least I think maybe this was only in my head that when I was thinking about, is it's so many therapists seem to, and actually this was kind of your experience, I believe, where it's like I.F.S, these modalities kind of blow up because of their effectiveness. And so I want to be able to kind of like wear that badge of honor. And so I'm going to go and
help. I mean, there's a lot of helping intention. Like, I want to help. And it is a badge of honor on some level.
Yeah, no, I don't think people want to wear badges of honor just always through ego. I think people get into the helping profession, because they want to help. So it's not to, talk negatively towards that intent, because they are evidence-based. You're not going to go seek something that's total BS. And because it's so tough to get into the I.F.S.I trainings, it's easy to seek these other avenues and just want to stay kind of in the cognitive and learn the skills where, learn the theory, like you just said, and you can't, that's just not how this one works, people.
That's not how this one works.
Nope. It's just not how this one works.
It's not CBT. I do want to, it's not
DBT or, which are amazing.
All have a place.
Well, I guess I want to ask, so you talked about how you get all of these inquiries. We have a podcast about, I.F.S and laying the foundation in an attempt to kind of help bridge the gap and educate people. Is it easier, would you say, for you as a therapist when people do come in and have like some foundational knowledge, or yes and no, maybe?
I'm working with my system to answer this in a way that is PC.
Well, yeah, that little laugh kind of.
Yeah. So, most of the time I'm going to say no, it's not easier. But it depends. It also goes back to that original discussion of the different energies behind who I'm seeing. Is their system truly curious, open-hearted to wherever this goes? If that's the case, then cool. Read away. Listen to the podcast. Listen to Dick Schwartz doing 146 sessions. Awesome. Assuming there is enough open-hearted, self-led curiosity to what this experience is going to be like for you. It will look different than the sessions you hear Dick doing. It will look different than the transcripts you've read in No Bad Parts. It will look different than just reading a book, because I.F.S. is not talk therapy. And we can talk about what a session looks like for people who may need to know that. I mean, I.F.S. can be talk therapy, and that's called direct access, which is very different, and sort of the gold standard where we're aspiring to get to with a client system is what we call insight work, which is where we are turning in to be with their parts, not just talking about their parts. Because remember, y'all, when we read a book, we're talking about parts. We're not experiencing them. We're not actually with them. We're talking about them. So what happens a lot of times with clients who have read a book and have parts of themselves who have a bit of a rigidity around what this should look like or an agenda, that can feel, for me and my system, more challenging. And that goes back to that intermediate syndrome, the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Which is this cognitive bias that causes people, us, to overestimate our abilities. I read a book, therefore I know. I took a P.S.A workshop, therefore I'm a good I.F.S. therapist. And so, that idea is that, for those of us who know less about a topic, we have a tendency to overestimate our skill and our competence the most. And so I have noticed for some clients who have such a super strong agenda, like this is what I need to do. That's very part driven already. And so those clients can be more challenging for my system to work with, because there's more correcting that almost needs to happen. And at times it can feel like a power struggle between their all-knowing parts who think it should look a certain way because they read the book versus how it actually is in the experience.
Well, yeah, and I don't know if this is your if this is your experience as a therapist, but it kind of that agenda word that we use all of the time, like the thought of having, if I were to come into your office and come in already being like, okay, well, I have, these are the parts that I want to unburden, and this is this, and this is how, I want it to look. And then it doesn't go that way. There is kind of like a power struggle there where my system and those parts and have an agenda to come in and get this solved.
Their heady managers are the ones driving the therapy bus.
Yeah.
Right. So then that can take a bit of time. Like that can take actually a lot of time but to work to unblend. Right. Like I love it when clients are like, gosh, these are my struggles. This is what's going on in my life. I think it's this part. Great. Cool. So we have some trailheads, and let's be open to the process. Right. There's that dialectic of, this is what I want to work on. This is why I'm reaching out to you, and trusting the process to unfold how it needs to. Right.
The slow is fast, the
slow is fast
of the system, like the whole process, not just, I have this, and this, and I want to like get to the bottom of it.
Right. I want to get to the bottom of it. How fast will this take? How many sessions do I need to see you for?
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Oh,
Yeah.
I get that all the time. And so I think the most critical ingredient to set a really rich I.F.S experience therapeutically into motion is curiosity, that open-hearted, genuine curiosity, not that I got to get to the bottom of this shit curiosity, because that's really not curiosity. But
Well, that was going to be kind of one of my questions too, is like, okay, so we've identified some of the things to look out for on your end and on the client's end when they're reaching out. So I guess what are people to expect, for a session to go well? Like, how do you know on either end for a session to go well? And then what do you also expect if you're a client going into a good I.F.S session? Good, quote unquote.
Well, yeah, good and well are obviously judgmental as hell words, but I'm down with them. So I think the most critical ingredient, like I said, is curiosity, for regardless of what role you find yourself in, whether it's the therapist or the client, just open-hearted curiosity, an openness to see where it all goes without any agenda. And I think what to expect in an I.F.S session, and this happens a lot too. And I have parts that are like, oh, put a disclaimer out, Amy. If any of your current clients are going to hear this, they're going to be like, oh no. Or anybody who's like, oh, I was going to email her, but she sounds pretty abrasive. Everything I'm saying is not meant to shame anybody's parts. It's just meant to help educate and clarify. So a lot of times people will also come into reach out wanting to work with an I.F.S therapist, thinking they may know what this looks like, having read the book and or not having read the book. And they don't know what they don't know and don't really know how an I.F.S session actually goes. And so it ends up looking like traditional talk therapy. And then it just keeps looking like talk therapy because that's what therapy is by history. You go to someone, you talk about the same stuff over and over and over and over and over again. Same week, different week, same story. Traditional talk therapy. And so if a client doesn't know the difference of what I.F.S is, they don't know what to do. And so that then falls on to us as the therapist or practitioner to be able to help them move towards what an I.F.S session looks like. So in the beginning of working with a new client, I try as hard as I can without wrestling them into turning in, to start getting curious about perhaps a part of them that's showing up even in that initial session. And a lot of times in the first session, that's not where we go, because they have their historian parts who want to catch me up on every single little bit of their life, which is fine. Mm-hmm. And then I encourage them to begin thinking about us starting to turn towards a part that they would like to get to know a little bit more. And so with an I.F.S session, there are essentially two entry points to begin working with a client's parts. One of them is direct access, which is where we are really doing a little bit more of traditional talk therapy, and we're talking about parts and we're conceptualizing through the I.F.S lens. That can be done both explicitly or implicitly. I probably don't need to get into that too much. But what I'm doing is reflecting back to the client the parts I'm hearing them speak for, even if they're not speaking for their parts. I'm really hearing a part of you struggling in relationship with your husband right now. Oh, okay, yeah. So part of you is really feeling a lot of grief over the end of this relationship. Wow, part of you is really feeling overwhelmed, even if they're not using those words. That's more of a direct access side of I.F.S, which is sometimes where we have to hang out with the client for a while if their system isn't quite ready to turn in. So the other way in which an I.F.S session can go, and I'm going to use this word preferred, even though that is kind of a yucky, sticky word. The the goal, if you will, is at following the pace and tempo of the client system is in time to get them to move to insight I.F.S work, which is where we are turning in, thus the name of our podcast, where the self of the client acts as a guide to the self of the therapist acts as a guide to the self of the client for them to turn in, often with eyes closed if that feels right, so that the client can begin connecting with the parts of them and acting as a translator to the therapist. And the therapist is a conduit for that connection to the client's internal world. And so it often looks like really a guided meditation of sorts, but an active meditation, a guided meditation of sorts between the client's system, self of the client, to parts of the client, with the therapist guiding sort of this informal interview of sorts, if you will. And so that's sort of what the goal to get to that place in I.F.S is, because that's where the richness starts happening. And that's, where then clients can start to do some of this on their own, where they can start slowing down and doing that U-turn. That was a bit long-winded, but
no, I think it does exemplify the importance of having done like that kind of 3-year period that you were talking about, like having done the experiential aspect of it and like engaging in your own practice, whatever your level, but especially as someone, as a therapist or practitioner who's then going to guide other people, because and I'm going to totally butcher this, but there's this thing, and maybe there's a more organized quote to go along with it, but there's kind of this thing where it's like, our parts will respond externally to other people's parts in the same way that we respond to them internally. So like if somebody's,
Yep.
I don't know what a great example is, but if somebody is, let's say like acting out in some way externally in our lives and we're having like major judgment towards them, it's probably oftentimes because that's how, when we act out, that's how we respond and react to ourselves. So I say that because as a therapist, you just said like you're sitting there helping guide the self energy. And so if someone's sitting in a session explaining something to you, about how they're doing, you don't want to then respond to them through a part, and do the best we can. We're all human, but that's kind of what my mind initially thinks of when people want to like show themselves as an expert, or they, as the therapist, have the agenda going into the session along with the client to get to a certain space. It's just ineffective for what I.F.S was built for, which is that expansive, open-hearted curiosity to sit with whatever comes up, and all parts are welcome, and all of those little juicy taglines.
Well, and the hardest part of I.F.S is unblending. That's the hardest. That is the hardest element of I.F.S. And that's why I think it's absolutely critical for people, especially in the beginning, to work with someone who knows what they're doing. Because that's most of us, it's not like we just have one part popping hot every once in a while. Right? Like
it'd be a lot more simple.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, then we probably could do it on our own a lot more easily.
Right.
Most of the time it's a part shit show where there's tons of parts showing up, whether strongly or not. Rarely, if ever, is it just, oh, cool, there's just one part. Even if we start in session, if I start with a client's part, like for instance, I was working with a client the other day who had a suicidal part. And, one of the very first questions an effective, well-trained I.F.S therapist could, and I would encourage, should use as we're going into insight work, the turning in type of work, is, all right, as you begin to close your eyes and settle in, connecting with your breath, if that feels right, go ahead and just notice, are there any other parts, energies, feelings, sensations showing up in response to working with the suicidal part, this part that wants to take you out? Because usually right then and there, before we even started the damn session, there's parts that are already up about it. Sure enough, yeah, there's a part of, I'm feeling closed off. This part's, I have like some energy that's terrified to go there because they're afraid if I go there, then that means we're going to give it attention, which means it's going to get bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Bing, 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 bing. Guess what? Then we need to unblend because we have more voices showing up than just the one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the nuanced richness, beauty, magic, and tough as hell element of I.F.S. that I don't think a lot of people understand just by reading a book.
Yeah. No, 100%. I think, we've said it a couple times, and I want to just reiterate how fantastic all of these resources are, and just what they can do to add on to, our experience on either side in whatever role, and just how important it is to go through the proper channels. And I mean, like, don't be shy to ask, your therapist where they got their training, or, like, this is your taking responsibility for your own mental health and well-being, and making sure that you're working with somebody who has been doing their own work as well, which brings me to...
And also, real fast, keep that thought.
Yep.
And don't be discouraged if because you read a book, you can't do it yourself. Please. Yeah. Don't be discouraged if because you as a client read a book and you can't do it. You shouldn't be able to.
Well, and I mean, you said that in the beginning, and I know that we came in hot, and I said, you know what, it's really freaking annoying. It's even to me, who's not getting 30 to 50 emails, trying to, and we're not bringing this up to say, don't stop reaching out. Again, I want to drive home. The point of this podcast was to provide education and lay the foundation. It's just it's a matter of slowing it down in some way. Like, it's a PSA to slow down with some of this stuff. And
well, I think our mission has been to educate and also debunk myths. So this is sort of a myth debunking episode, right? Like, it's not easy. I.F.S. isn't easy, even if it appears so on page 72 of No Bad Parts.
We're the Mythbusters today.
Yeah.
I guess when you were talking a second ago, I mean, as you've talked throughout the episode, we've talked about how important it is to do your own work. That point's been driven home. So I guess, Amy, like, do you as a therapist then work with an I.F.S. therapist?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. At this stage of the game, for me and my own system, most of the time I can handle whatever my system's throwing at me on my own. And I still regularly work with a therapist, an I.F.S. certified therapist. So yes.
Well, I think that kind of goes to show how we all get stuck. We're all we all stuck, or
we have blind spots.
Trouble. We have blind spots, have trouble on blending, et cetera, et cetera. I think, so.
And remember, self begets self. So I can still have mad amounts of self on. And if I have somebody else in the room who also has mad amounts of self on, it just really helps catalyze, hold the space for, and sometimes even expedite my healing. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the neurobiological rewiring that can and will happen if this is done, appropriately and in good time. So anything else that I missed, Amy? I feel like we kind of came into this, and I like the Mythbusters thing because it is, I don't know, there are parts of me that get up in their tree when we talk about this. Just being in the mental health industry, being a therapist, I feel like I see both sides of, I see clients being impacted or given misinformation or thinking they know after 2 weeks of introduction. I mean, even if it's really, really well taught introduction, it's still 2-3 weeks of introduction, and it's beautiful.
And I'm so sorry I'm sort of so sorry. I have parts that just can't stand it in any realm of life when people have a brief dipping of the toe in whatever the water is, sports, like therapy, whatever it is, just because you've done a little bit doesn't mean you're an expert.
Right.
So sorry,
yeah,
go ahead. So yeah, as soon as you said it, I found my body going like, oh God, that's one of my biggest pet peeves.
Well, you know what it does for me and my system, because again, I get up in my tree and I kind of feel that same way even right now, is like it's that kind of thing that we hear all of the time, again, whatever the topic may be, I.F.S aside, of like, oh yeah, I did my research. And it's like, no. Like you watched a YouTube video, love YouTube, spend a lot of time on YouTube. You watched a YouTube video and read an article. That doesn't mean that you like know how to change my furnace. So anyways, anything, back to you, anything that you wanted to touch on with, are kind of coming in hot just because you read a book, you don't know I.F.S episode?
No, I feel good. Okay. Those parts feel like having been spoken for, that they generally get annoyed with anyone who thinks, really, I'm not even an expert in I.F.S, and I've done it for a long time. Like,
right.
I know the model, I trust the model, and that's what I rely upon, is my trust in the model. But yeah. So expert busting, myth busting, all the things.
Intermediate syndrome, you guys, you don't have to have every answer. If you're a therapist, you don't have to know how to navigate every single situation. Fall back on the model as long as you're well trained. And if you're not well trained, go get well trained.
Yep. Boom.
Boom. Okay. Well, I love you very much, Dr. Amy Crawford. Always love having time with you. It's always a blessing. And thank you, everybody. Always a major blessing when we upload, to be able to see that people are still, downloading and listening and consuming, this stuff, because it's something that we're really passionate about. We take time to do, and that you guys seem to be really enjoying. So if there's any suggestions that you guys have too about topics, we've got a few interviews lined up and a few topics that we've got upcoming, and episodes that we're going to drop. And if there's ever any specific inquiry, we can always pay mind to your guys' interests and inquiries as well. So thanks again for tuning in to the Turning In podcast, and we will see you guys next time. Bye.